Hi, I'm Skip Nipper. Welcome to Skip's Corner, the podcast where I tell you about not only Nashville's great baseball history and traditions,
shot to right, a one-hop liner,
but certainly about its past. And you will hear a little bit about its present and future, too.
Yes, he can, and makes the waist-high catch.
There are great stories about Tom Wilson Park, Herschel Greer Stadium, Sulphur Dell, and the players, coaches, and fans who love everything about baseball. And every once in a while, you will get to hear from a special guest who will share their fondness and even passion for the great game.
The high fly ball down the right field corner, going way back, hits a lead-off home run.
In the not-too-distant past, the Nashville Old Timers Baseball Association honored not only a local amateur baseball Hall of Fame member, but we still do that, but also an Umpires Hall of Fame, and there has been one for softball. You can see the list of inductees by going to otbaseball.com. That's the Old Timers website, looking for the About menu item. And that takes you to a scroll-down menu. You can look at Hall of Fame to see the list. You can also look at Mr. Baseball, the Board of Directors, bylaws, and other things there. Some great baseball players and names of umpires and softball players are there. Now that takes me to a game that has kind of been lost in time, and it's an unusual game that calls out the great players in Nashville. Baseball, as we know it, had its foundations in the 1800s, probably around 1835. A few years before the Mills Commission declared that Abner Doubleday drew out the playing field and wrote a few rules in 1839. Well, that theory has been debunked, as Doubleday was at West Point and nowhere near Finney's Field at that time, where supposedly the first game was drawn out. Doc Adams is probably the true father of baseball, but more on that another time. But I want to ask you this question. How do you think softball started? Was it a derivative of baseball? Probably not, according to a writer by the name of Alex Rees. He wrote this on a website titled flowsoftball.com, and that's FLO softball.com. He says it all began in 1887 when a crowd of people gathered inside the Farragut Boat Club to await the result of the Harvard versus Yale football game. Remember, this is 1887, and when the result came in, a 17-8 victory by Yale, one ecstatic Yale fan threw an old boxing glove at a Harvard fan, who responded by swinging at the glove with a broomstick he was holding. Now, okay, if this is softball lore, this is softball lore. But Reese goes on to write, looking on with interest, a reporter by the name of George Hancock suggested they play a game of indoor baseball, he called it. He tied together the strings of the pair of boxing gloves to make a ball and used a piece of chalk to draw a home plate, a pitcher's mound, and bases. And the initial game of softball ended with a final score of 41-40, and thus a new sport was born. Reese goes on to say in the spring, Hancock introduced the game to the outdoors, calling it indoor-outdoor, and the sport was played on a smaller diamond than the traditional baseball fields. Hancock amended 19 new rules, which were adopted by the Midwinter Indoor Baseball League of Chicago 2 years later in 1889. And there you have the beginning of a new sport in the 19th century. But Reese tells us also how it came to be known by the name we are familiar with. He says, in 1926, a man named Walter Hankinson, a YMCA official in Denver, coined the term softball, and by 1930, that became the officially recognized name of the sport. Well, from that time, softball flourished just about everywhere, but it was a drastic change from tried and true baseball in many areas. But a tournament held in 1933 at the Chicago World's Fair spurred interest in the game even further. And the American Softball Association, ASA, was founded in 1933. But even then, the sport was a stepsister to baseball, and even admired newspaper man Freddie Russell whether in jest or in disbelief, wrote this line under the heading "The Sissy" in his August 13, 1933 Nashville Banner column when he wrote, I think it's tongue in cheek. I don't know, maybe he's really being serious, but he wrote, "It is strange to note to what extremes some people will go. Jack Price Jones, at last convinced he cannot play baseball, has influenced Kiwanian E.B. Stallman to launch a softball league for the civic clubs. I wonder what's next." Well, next was the formation in 1934 of 3 leagues to join the bankers, the civic clubs, and the Presbyterians leagues. And teams sprouted up: Worthen Bag, Tennessee Biscuit, the Generals, the Tennessean, Upchurch Mattress, and Woodall Coal Company, to name a few. And these teams joined others to make a city league, industrial league, and what was known in Nashville as an American League, softball league, with the 3 leagues combined accounting for about 25 teams in 1934. And although there were high school teams in the 1930s, in April of 1936, they formed the first regular high school softball league. And members included Cumberland, East Joelton, Isaac Litton, Central, Tennessee Industrial School, David Lipscomb, Father Ryan, Peabody, Hillsborough, Hume Fogg, and Donaldson. And as best I can tell, these are boys' leagues. But amateur softball began to flourish, with leagues popping up everywhere. And Nashville was one of the cities where it became really prevalent. My friend Farrell Owens, now deceased, may he rest in peace, once said he thought softball and youth baseball had as much to do with minor leagues going out of business in the 1960s, because the moms and dads, the parents, the kids, the families weren't going to minor league baseball games anymore. They were busy with their own local leagues in softball and Little League. And, I can't disagree with Farrell Owens. But slow pitch softball is commonly played recreational, while what became fast pitch is, pitching fast, and often really fast. How about 80 miles an hour and higher? Well, that brings me to an incredible game that took place in 1954. Some might remember it, or your grandfather may have told you about it. You may have read about it, as it adds to the very lore of softball in Nashville. And since this is a baseball podcast, also adds to the baseball lore. There's always a Nashville baseball connection. And there were unexpected results. Now, here's how it's set up. Nashville Bridge Company had a terrific City League baseball team in 1954, capturing a 4th consecutive City League crown with a 23-5 record. And a game was scheduled between their team and Wright's Photos at Shelby number 1, now Old Timers number 1 at Shelby Park. It was not unusual to schedule additional games after the regular season, but you see, Wright's Photos was the city softball champions, and they had a record of 32-8. Now, this is interesting. Scheduled for Wednesday night, September the 1st, 1954, Nashville Banner sports writer Edgar Allen wrote an evening column about the 2 teams to meet later that evening. And Edgar Allen wrote, "Wrights, the softball team, will rule a slim favorite, mainly on the assumption that the Bridgers, the Nashville Bridge Company team, won't be able to get their bats around in time to hit the dazzling pitches of Fred Morris." And Allen went on to list the accolades of this fireballing pitcher. Morris compiled a 20-2 record this year, he said. He fanned 297, walked 61, hit 25, and he chalked up 3 no-hitters. Now, by the way, Morris is in the Old Timers Softball Hall of Fame. His mound opponent was to be Jim Stevens, who everybody figured would be named the City League's most valuable player for the 3rd consecutive season. And it turned out that Stevens was unable to pitch, but a large crowd was expected to attend the game, scheduled for 7:30 p.m. that Wednesday night, September the 1st, 1954. And emergency March of Dimes workers were going to be passing through the stands, collecting money for their polio drive. And here's how the game would be played, because I know you're interested in that. 2 teams, 1 softball, 1 baseball. How does it get set up? Well, Morris was going to pitch from a regulation softball distance of 46 feet, and the baseballers facing him would use the regulation softball bats and run the 60-foot baselines. So for the baseballers, it's a softball game. But Nashville Bridge Company's pitcher would pitch from a regulation pitcher's distance of 60 feet, 6 inches, and the softballers will use baseball bats and run the 90-foot bases. So the softballers, when they're at bat, they're playing a baseball game. In other words, when DeBricko bats a softball game, when Wright's softballers bat, it's a regulation baseball game. And the teams would use only one set of bases in the game. And this is how they set this up. Umpires T.J. Ladd and Paul Bush, Bush is an Old Timers Umpires Hall of Fame member, would move the bases to the correct spots after each team bats. Now, is that confusing? Do you need further clarification? Well, I think you got it. But here's the lineup for both teams. You'll recognize some of these names, I think, if your dad or your grandfather played in City League games, especially, maybe those softball games too. Here's the lineup for both teams. Here's Nashville Bridge Company. Batting first was Corky Hartman in center field, Billy Stinnett at third base. Now, those two are in the Nashville Old Timers Baseball Amateur Hall of Fame. Batting third was George Archie in right field. Now, he was a Mr. Baseball selection for the Old Timers. Batting cleanup was Jack Miller, the shortstop. Soapy Fresh in left field. Gerald Mama Johnson at first. Billy Hartman at second. Judy McBride catching, another Mr. Baseball for the Old Timers. And Harry Moneypenny pitching in lieu of Jim Stevens not being able to be there. And for Wright's, the softball team, here's the lineup. Bobby Turner at shortstop, James Tigner at second base, Melvin Prim at first, Bubber Smith at center field. Bubber Smith is in the Softball Hall of Fame for Old Timers. Richard Prim at third, Les Bass at catching. I don't know the first name, but it's Whitehurst is the other outfielder. And good old Jimmy Eanes, who had a sporting goods store in Brentwood, was a great fan of Brentwood's youth leagues for many, many years. Everybody loved Jimmy Eanes, was a great softball player. And I think he's also in the Old Timers Softball Hall of Fame. And Fred Morris, of course, was the pitcher. You're wondering how the game turned out, aren't you? Well, the final score was 1-0. Does that help any? The game lasted an hour and a half. Does that help any? And $90 was raised for the polio fund. And the newspaper account does not say how many were on hand other than a large crowd. Well, I know you're wanting to know the rest of the story. Here's the scoop. Fred Morris struck out 17 baseball players. Only 4 baseball batters hit foul balls, and none got a single hit. And Morris tossed a no-hitter. Now, Wright's only got 3 hits off 2 Nashville Bridge Company pitchers. One of the hits was a triple down the right field line in the 6th inning by Bubber Smith, another softball Hall of Famer, scoring Melvin Prim with the game's only run. And Richard Prim and Les Bass had the only other hits, both singles. Now, Morris struck out Soapy Fresh, the City League's top hitter, Corky Hartman, and Jack Miller 3 times each. Now, with memories of Eddie Feiner in his court, softballers who challenged and beat baseball teams across the country, there may have never been a better example of the challenge met at Shelby No. 1 in 1954 when softball and Fred Morris were king. After all, softball had only been around for about 20 years or so, and there was time to be made up to prove how strong the sport was. But let me ask you this question, to you, the listener. What happened to softball leagues that were thriving in the 1950s all the way through the early 2000s? Where'd they go? There were softball leagues, I'm sure you'll remember, playing all week long and on Saturdays, sometimes early morning games like the Ford Glass Plant. When their evening late night crew got off, they'd go over to the ballpark and play games, had their own league. There were men's and boys, women's and girls leagues, and you could hardly get a diamond to practice on. Yes, there are softball games played in high schools and colleges, women's teams, and there are some great ones. But again, what happened to those industrial and church league, softball leagues all across this city and other places? Where'd they go? Have we gone soft? Well, thanks for listening in. I hope you'll listen again. I went kind of off topic a little bit, but then I think I drew it back into Nashville's baseball history is very important. And even though it was a softball, quasi-baseball game, it was a great game and a great testament to not only softball, to baseball too. Thanks for listening.